My wife Jane and I are really happy to be here. This class is legendary. This is a dynamic class. Sonny has done such an amazing job over the years, and I'm humbled just to be standing in the place that he stood. And we're truly looking forward to exploring God's Word with you in the coming weeks, or however God leads us to be here. So thank you for having us. And today we're going to be in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 7. I think that's continuing on where you guys left off a week or so ago. Now, in chapters 5 and 6, leading up to chapter 7, what we see is this intense dislike for Jesus increasing. And they start by just sort of being amused about what he's doing, but then it gets more heated. The dislike grows. People are more, especially the leadership, are more concerned. And we know that the end result of that dislike then just turns to pure, unadulterated hatred. And as we know, then the hatred changes and turns to the murder of our Lord. And so here in the beginning of chapter 7, we see Jesus moving his area of operation from Judea to Galilee. And this was no small change in venue. It's 50 miles from Judea to Galilee. You know, a man of Jesus' age at that time, in his apparent level of health and vitality, it would take him 2 or 3 days to walk that distance. So this is a pretty big deal, a pretty big change that he's making. And what we're going to see here in chapter 7 is Jesus is not necessarily the victim of their hatred. Rather, Jesus is part of a preordained schedule, a timeline that was established and set forth by God to fulfill a godly mission. And this is going to be a reoccurring theme that I'm going to want to address as we go through this morning's lesson, that God is in control. We know that. God is in control. There's a godly timeline. There's a schedule which he has set forward. So in this chapter, we'll see Jesus avoiding situations that don't necessarily correspond with that divine timeline, and how Jesus purposed to let that timeline unfold naturally. So if you'll join me in verse 1 of chapter 7, it says, "After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry, because the Jews sought to kill him." Now, after these things is an important 3 words, because after these three things relates back to chapter 6. Chapter 6 stops, and then there's a time period, and then chapter 7 starts. That's the after these things. It's thought that could be as much as 6 months, that the narrative stops in John. John stops the narrative. There's something happening, but he doesn't record it in this gospel. Chapter 6 speaks of the events of the Passover. And the Passover happens in April. Chapter 7 speaks of the Feast of the Tabernacles. And the Feast of the Tabernacles happens in October. So you see, we have this gap in the narrative that John puts forth. Now, the question that I wonder is, why is there this break in the narrative? Why isn't this gap filled in? Well, I think the answer could be that John's purpose in writing, one of the purposes of writing this gospel, isn't an exhaustive chronology of Jesus' life or the disciples. Rather, his purpose is to highlight, to spotlight, to bring forth Jesus as the Messiah and Jesus as the Son of God. That's his purpose. His purpose is not to create a chronology. So chapter 6 highlights Jesus as he is ministering to the masses. Then at a point, the focus changes to the training of the disciples. And again, there's this 6-month gap. Likely, that's what Jesus is doing. He's starting to train the disciples, starting to get them understanding what his real ministry is. And there's probably a great deal of importance and intensity during that time of training. Now, verse 2, it says, "Now the Jews' feast of the tabernacles was at hand." Now, the Feast of the Tabernacles was associated with the bounty of the harvest. And in that agrarian society, what you have is agriculture is a very important thing. I forgot to start my timer. So please tell me when I'm done. So in this agrarian society, the harvest is really important. The main crops at that time were olives and grapes. A good diet, I would say, olives and grapes. And the Feast of the Tabernacles is an important feast. And it goes back to, if you look at Leviticus 23, verses 33 through 36, I'm going to read this to you. It says, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of the Tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. On the first day shall be an holy convocation. Ye shall not do servile work therein." You're going to rest. 7 days ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day shall be an holy convocation unto you, and you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly, and ye shall do no servile work therein. And then again in verses 39 to 43, it goes on, and it says, "Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when you are gathered in the feast unto the Lord, 7 days, on the first day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath." So it starts on the Sabbath, and it ends on the Sabbath. "And you shall take you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, and the branches of palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees, and willows of the brook, and ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. And you shall keep it a feast unto the Lord 7 days in a year. It shall be a statute forever in your generation. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. Ye shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that Israelites born shall dwell in booths. The reason? That your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am your God." Now, my wife Jane and I, we were in Israel during the Festival of the Booths, the festival, Feast of the Tabernacles. And honestly, in my opinion, it sort of looked like downtown LA. You know, there's these shanties all along the streets and these shacks, literally, that people are living in. But this was how they were being obedient to God's direction on how they should celebrate the Feast of the Booths. Some people, especially in the urban areas, would not put the booths on the ground, but would actually put them on the roofs of their houses. And today, even then and today, that feast is typically in October, which is sort of interesting because the harvest is typically between April and June. So they'd bring in the harvest, they'd do all the processing thereof, and then they would have time for the Feast of the Tabernacles. Now, Josephus, who was the Jewish historian and military leader, he was born around 37 AD, and he's widely regarded as a very reliable source in historical matters. Speaks of 3 very important festivals in that culture. The first one being Passover, the second one being Pentecost, and the third was the Feast of the Tabernacles. And of the 3, the Feast of the Tabernacles was the most popular. It could be that they took 7 days off to celebrate it. Who knows? Maybe it was a holiday as well. So, as I said, the people built these structures, and that's where they dwelt, in remembrance of God saving them out of Egypt. And now in verse 3, I lost my place. 1 second, please. Yeah, in verse 3 it says, his brethren therefore said unto him, his brethren, depart hence and go to Judea, that thy disciples also may see the works that thou do. So in Matthew 13, there's a list of Jesus' half-brothers. Now, remember, Mary is the mother of Jesus, but Joseph is not the father. But there were other children in the family where Mary and Joseph were the parents. And those half-brothers were James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, also known as Jude. Now, these are pretty august individuals, right? I mean, James wrote the book of James. Jude wrote the book of Jude. These were the brothers of Jesus. But it's sort of interesting. We'll see where they were at this time relative to Jesus and accepting him. So verse 4 says, and the brothers are speaking still, for there is no man that does anything in secret, and he himself seeketh not to be known openly. If thou do these things, show thyself to the world. So the brothers of Jesus are interested in Jesus getting out there and broadcasting the work that he's doing. And their argument was, nobody does anything of value and keeps it secret. What you do is you want people to know about it, especially when that valuable thing is something as like saving people's souls and giving them eternal life, or healing people in this case. They were very interested in getting him out there and sharing that. Now, this gets back to my original comments, though, that there's a specific timeline which Jesus is adhering to. And that timeline might not make sense on a human level. Jesus had his timeline. The brethren thought they knew better, and they're trying to persuade him to do something about that. And honestly, don't all of us sort of have had times where we thought that the timeline of God wasn't exactly matching up with what we wanted or what we thought we needed? I mean, this is a common theme that you see. This happened 2,000 years ago that we're studying, but it's happening right here in Dana Point, too. And one of the reasons is because we think we know what the best course of action is, unfortunately. But Psalm 27 says, wait on the Lord. Be of good courage. Sometimes it takes courage to wait. And he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Boy, those are strong words. Those are really strong words. And Isaiah 55 says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That's the comfort we have. We have a God that loves us, and we have a God that wants the best for us. And he knows a lot more than we do. And he's reminding us of that. So why do you think the brothers might have taken such a keen interest in getting Jesus to be more public? We can only speculate. This is Bob Harvey in the margins, okay? They weren't believers yet. We're going to see that in a few more verses. They probably weren't believers yet. And they needed personally more proof. And they were skeptical. And this would be a vehicle by which they could see Jesus working more and filling in some of those blanks that maybe they were still concerned about. Or maybe they were a little entrepreneurial and they saw a profit opportunity here or something. Or they could benefit themselves or benefit Jesus, but not knowing what Jesus' real mission was. Or maybe they just wanted to expose people to his work. We don't know, but we do know they were pretty aggressive in trying to get him to go to Judea. So who knows? But in verse 5, this is what I just said. For neither did his brethren believe in him. At this point, the brothers don't believe in Jesus. Thankfully, we see when we get to Acts that in the upper room we see the brethren in one accord. That's not the Honda sedan. In one accord, they're in prayer and supplication. They do believe. Verse 6 says, then Jesus responds to them. He says, my time is not yet come, but your time is always ready. Your time is always ready. So Jesus brings them back to that heavenly plan, that timeline, that schedule, that purpose that has been preordained. It is not his perfect timing, but he puts his dependence on the Father who knows the season. Again, in Acts 1:7 it says, it is not for you to know the times or seasons which the Father hath put in his own power. Depend on God. Depend on his timeline. You know, at the end of that verse, it speaks about the brothers always being ready. And that's sort of a curious phrasing there. I think what Jesus is likely referring to is their unbelief. And that's what prevents them from understanding God's will. So any time would be okay for them to go to Galilee, but that's not God's plan. So Jesus is saying, you're ready to go, but that's not God's plan. And how do we know God's plan? By walking closer to him, by being in communion with him as closely as possible. That's how we can be more assured of what God's plan is. And then in verse 7 it says, Jesus goes on to say, the world cannot hate you, speaking to his brethren, but me it hates, because I, Jesus, testify that the works thereof are evil. Well, here's Jesus is making a pretty definitive statement, pretty strong statement. The world cannot hate the brethren. Why? Because at this point, they're part of the world. So the world is not going to hate itself. But Jesus is not part of the world. And he makes that clear and distinct proclamation that the world is evil. And isn't that something we all see every day? I mean, whether it be government proclamations or decrees or decisions that they're making, or whether it's our fellow citizens destroying or killing, we see evil every day. The world is evil. Verse 8, Jesus goes on to say, go ye up to the feast, I go not up yet unto this feast. For again, the theme, my time has not come. There is a defined timeline, and Jesus is working through that. Something that we have to accept. We might not understand it, but we have to accept it. So Jesus here gives his brothers permission to go up to Galilee, but he makes it pretty clear. He makes it absolutely clear, really. He's not going. So because he's committed to that divine timetable. Now, the fear of death was not his motivator. It was the unfolding of history that was the important issue here that Jesus is going to let happen. And it's, again, the takeaway for us is that God has a perfect plan, and it's incumbent upon us to patiently trust in that plan and wait to see how it unfolds. Verse 10 creates a bit of a problem here. But when his brethren were gone up, then he went up also unto the feast, not openly, but as in secret. So the previous verse says, I'm not going. And now he's going. Well, he's not going publicly. He's going in secret. He doesn't go up to be demonstrative and to broadcast openly what he's about, but he goes up secretly. So that's probably what the reason for the inconsistency, seeming inconsistency there. And verse 11 says, and the Jews sought him at the feast, and they said, where is he? Now, the authorities expected that Jesus would be there. It's sort of like when you have a big event, you know, you expect the luminaries to be there because that's where they can be more visible, where they can have a bigger platform. So the authorities thought, well, this is an obvious and logical place that Jesus should show up. So they asked the brethren, his brothers, they said, well, where is he? And in my way of thinking, there's a sense of anger here that the leaders are expressing. Like, where is he? Come on, you know? We expect him to be here. Why isn't he here? They didn't know, again, what the time frame was all about. So in verses 12 and 13, we see what's going on at this feast. And there was much murmuring among the people concerning him, that is Jesus, and some said, he's a good man. And others said, nah, he deceives people. He's a liar. And other people said, well, how be it? No man spake openly about him for the fear of the Jews. So as is the case today, similarities are so obvious. What happened then is still happening today. Things don't change. There's no new things under the sun, right? So there's many opinions about Jesus. Some recognized his goodness. And I mean, logically, how could you do otherwise? Here's a guy who has compassion, who's caring for people, he's healing people. How could that not be a good man? But others thought he was a deceiver. And although there seems to be no evidence that they're putting forth that he's a deceiver, this is the view that was held. And others, other than one thing, and that is Jesus was challenging the status quo. There was a system in place. It worked really well for the hierarchy, for the leaders, and Jesus was there to upset that existing structure. Now, when we get to verse 14, the next 10 verses, there's a little shift. There's a little shift in the narrative. And we see, in spite of increased hostility during these 10 verses, Jesus continues to be bold in his teaching and his ministering. And during these 10 verses, we'll see that there are 5 reasons that are proffered to give evidence that Jesus is who he claims to be. And the 5 reasons are, first of all, his supernatural knowledge. And second, how that knowledge could be confirmed. And third, his actions demonstrating his selflessness for the impact he has on the world. And 5, the deeds he is showing that he is indeed the Son of God. So we'll explore these. First of all, in verse 14, we see, now about the midst of the feast, in the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. Now again, this is sort of interesting timing. I should have brought a big clock, you know? That would have helped with the timing analogy. This is, it's sort of interesting. He went up in the middle of the feast. He waited to the middle. He didn't hit the Feast of the Tabernacles, immediately go to the temple and start doing what he wanted to do. He wasn't overly enthusiastic in doing that, although the people probably wanted him to do that. The people were probably eager to hear him present his message and see, what new miracle is he going to do today? But he waits. He waits into the middle of the feast. The brethren wanted him to do it right away, but Jesus did not. So he went to the temple, and this was the common custom of prominent rabbis and teachers. And the temple was a type of forum from which knowledge could be dispensed, and people knew that's where to go to receive knowledge. Sort of reminds me of a TED Talk. You want to get some knowledge, you turn on TED Talk and you get the expert. When this 2,000 years ago, you went to the temple and you heard the latest knowledge being imparted. And then verse 15, I think, is just a tremendously great verse. And the Jews marveled. The Jews marveled, saying, how knoweth this man letters he never learned? How did this guy get so smart? Is what they're asking. But what really caused me to pause and to wonder about this verse was asking myself, how many times can I marvel at Jesus? I've been a Christian of 5 decades. Honestly, sometimes it becomes routine and common. I read the Bible, and I've read the Bible a lot of times, and although it still excites me, how many times do I really marvel at it? How many times do I look out there and marvel at his creation? How many times do I have that depth of passion about Jesus, what he does, the creation he has given us to enjoy, the impact he's had on my life, the blessings that I enjoy. That's a source of being able to, where we would marvel. And this is what's happening here. The Jews are astounded. They're marveling at this guy and what he's doing. I encourage us to think about how we might marvel at our Savior and how his impact on our lives and in our world. And here's the first case in verse 15, where there's, as I mentioned earlier, one of the proffers, one of the reasons of giving evidence for Jesus for what he claims is that the knowledge of his scripture is supernatural. The people know that. The leaders know that. How could he possibly know so much? He had no training. There were no books. How did he know so much? So especially since he had no formal training, which was something the rabbis and the teachers embraced with great enthusiasm. They wanted that training. And Jesus' answer is in verse 16. He knows what they're thinking. He may have heard what they were murmuring. And he answers them and he says, my doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me. So Jesus gives credit to his Father for the knowledge that he's enjoying, that he's imparting on the people. And really, what other reason could there be for him to have such encyclopedic global knowledge other than as a gift from his Father? Verse 17 says, if any man, Jesus says, if any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak myself. So Jesus is challenging those people that are criticizing him about where his knowledge comes from by saying, well, if you know God's will, you will know what I'm teaching is either right or wrong. And we know that it's right. So being obedient to God lives to a clear understanding of what is truth. And verse 18 goes on further to illuminate on that. Jesus says, he that speaketh of himself seeketh his own glory, but he that seeks his glory that sent him, the same is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. So the result is truth and righteousness on focusing on God. And in verse 19, Jesus reminds them that there's always been truth. There's always been truth to be known. Through Moses, other ways, but there's always been truth. In 19 he says, did not Moses give you the law? And yet none of you keeps the law. Why go ye about to kill me? So the truth has always been known. It was given to them through Moses. I can only think of the word condemns, but he condemns them that they did not abide in the truth. And because Jesus is calling this to their attention, there's a murderous anger that's developing. Verse 20 tells us how the people responded. The people answered and said, you have a devil. You have a demon. Who goes about to kill you? Can you just imagine them sort of laughing at him and sneering at our Lord, our King? The rudeness that must have been happening there. And Jesus, in all the wisdom that's all the universe, responds and says in verse 21, Jesus answered and said, I have done one work, and ye all marvel. And that one work is the healing of the paralytic. That's the work that he's referring to. And what he is going to tell him in verse 22 is that work happened on the Sabbath, which the leaders have a real problem with. But Jesus' response is, before they can even challenge him on that point, in verse 22, says, Moses therefore gave unto you circumcision, and then parentheses, not because it is of Moses, but of the fathers, the patriarchs, and ye on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. So the leaders circumcise on the Sabbath. Jesus healed on the Sabbath. A little problem here. If a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, why are you angry at me, Jesus, because I have made a man whole on the Sabbath? Sounds like a challenge to one's hypocrisy here, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Don't you get the sense that these leaders who are presumably self-righteous, important, self-important, honored by the people, we know that they went through town with all this regalia on themselves so that they were clear who the leaders were, and all of a sudden Jesus is bringing them low, pointing out that what they do is no different than what he did. But what they did was external, what he did was internal. Pretty interesting, pretty interesting. Verse 24 sort of puts the bow on the argument. he says, judge not, Jesus says, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. And what he's doing implicitly here is he's saying, leaders, you are just looking at the surface. You're looking on the outside. You don't get the inside. You don't understand that at all. And then in verse 25 through 36, the next 10 verses, again, we have another new section. And John is going to refocus the narrative to what we talked about earlier, that John's interest in the Gospel of John is portraying Jesus as Messiah and the Son of God. And we'll see in verse 31 that some of the people many people believed in him at this point. And because of that, the anger of the leaders is increasing, and plans are made to silence him. And Jesus confronts the people in three areas. First of all, the confusion that they have about him. Secondly, the conviction that they have. And third, the conversion decision that needs to be made. So in verse 25, we see that people are watching the leaders. The people, the general masses, are watching the leaders to see how they respond. And it says in verse 25, then said some of them of Jerusalem, is not this he whom these seek to kill? Wow. If he's the guy you seek to kill, why are you leaders responding to him the way you are? Why aren't you being more aggressive, I guess? And in verse 26, he said, but lo, he speaks boldly, and you say nothing unto him. Do the rulers know indeed that this is the very Christ? Is that the reason they're not going after him more aggressively? Because they know he's the Christ? Some of the people recognize Christ may well or is the Christ. And if he were truly a fraud, the people are saying, wouldn't you arrest him immediately? Wouldn't you get rid of him? Verse 27 says, howbeit we know this man whence he is, but when Christ comes, no man knows whence he is. So here's the confusion. People knew that Jesus came from Nazareth. They knew his story, if you will. They knew his upbringing to some degree. But the Jewish tradition was that the Messiah would be unknown. He would be a mystery into his actual appearance. Jesus didn't fit that mold. He didn't fit the preconceived notion that the leadership had. And then there's a great impassioned plea in verse 28. Then cried Jesus in the temple as he taught. When the word cried is used, what it really refers to is Jesus is speaking loudly and with force. It's an important statement that he's going to make, and he wants people to pay attention. He's stating that the people really don't know him. He says, ye both know me, and ye know whence I am, and I am not come of myself, and he that sent me is true, whom you do not know. But I know him, and I am from him, and he has sent me. So they may know Jesus in a human sense, but he's telling him, you don't know me in a divine sense. And they don't know God, because if they knew God, they'd know him. And the evidence of the lack of knowledge in God, excuse me, by the people is the fact that they're rejecting him. Thank you, sweetie. So there's a little circuitous discussion going on here. In verse 29, like I said, the contrast is clear between the solid ground of knowing God and being obedient to God's mission, and indeed Jesus being part of the Godhead. Verse 30 again, the timetable is set for now. For he says, then they sought to take him, but no man laid hands on him, because his hour had not yet come. There is a divine timeline. And many of the people believed in him in verse 31, and he said, when Christ comes, will he do more miracles than this man hath done? So the people here see it. They say, this guy's doing everything we expected the Messiah to do. Can anyone do more? And the implicit answer is no. So that's all I have for you this morning.